The following is from the video Gorilla Hebrew Utterly Refuted, which highlights the errors in Al-Azhar Band lawyer's commentary of vocab Malone's exchange with GMS on the fraudulent dialect known as Lashawan Qadash.
Let's go back to here. He says Eli, Eli, which is Eli, Eli. Why doesn't he say what he just said? No, it's not. You don't have an E sound in your fake language. There's no E sound. Okay, you have an E sound.
Prove to me there's an E sound in Hebrew at all without them dots. If you don't have them dots next to those letters, you don't know to make any of those sounds. When were those dots added to those letters? Who are the Masoretes?
Ironically, while Al-Azhar is essentially asking vocab to demonstrate that these other vocalizations that are not recognized by proponents of Lashawan Qadash, to demonstrate that these other vocalizations existed in Hebrew before the time of the Masoretes, before the Masoretes developed the various dots and dashes, the nikudot, which represent vocalizations. Ironically, Al-Azhar is making this request, but vocab has already demonstrated that with his appeals to the New Testament and also to his appeal to the Septuagint and so forth. Now, the question might be, how so? Here's how so. What we see is that centuries before the Masoretes, we have all these different sources that show these same vocalizations, that show a recognition of these vocalizations. So let's focus on the sound, this idea that when the string of characters, Aleph Lamed, in reference to a god is pronounced El, that this was pronounced El before the Masoretes, we have evidence of that. We have it in the transliterations in the Septuagint. We have evidence of it in the transliterations in the New Testament. And we could go to other sources, such as the transliterations in Josephus and the writings of Philo and so on. It's very, very clear that many centuries before the time of the Masoretes, people were already vocalizing this word in that way. So vocab has already demonstrated it, that this was the way it was pronounced in the time of Jesus. Aside from that, the next question which Al-Azhar asked touches on a bit of a complex subject, especially vis-a-vis trying to convey these things to proponents of Lashawan Qadash. So listen to this next question.
What is the matres lectionis?
So Al-Azhar asks, what is a mater lectionis, or what are matres lectionis? The question might seem simple enough, but it actually becomes a complex one when discussing it with proponents of Lashawan Qadash. Let's give the simple answer first. The phrase matres lectionis is employed in academic circles to refer to instances where certain consonants from the script of a Semitic language are employed in a way akin to vowels when writing certain words in that language. So, for example, there might be a word which a word which has an O sound or an U vocalization, and a wa is employed to signify that O or U vocalization. Alternatively, there might be a word with an E vocalization, which is to say a long I sound, like the vocalization in the English word feet or meat or tweet. And in those instances, a yod is employed to signify that E vocalization. The word mater lectionis means mother of the reading. The plural is matres lectionis. The relevant character is a quote-unquote mother insofar that she is your guide in the reading, removing some of the ambiguity regarding how the string of characters is to be vocalized. However, as was just touched on, this issue becomes a bit more complex when discussing it with proponents of Lashawan Qadash. First and foremost, the concept is rooted in a premise which proponents of Lashawan Qadash generally deny. That premise being that in ancient forms of Hebrew, including biblical Hebrew, a consonant followed by a wa or yod can point to that first consonant being vocalized with an o, u, or e vocalization. For example, suppose we have a bet followed by a wa. Understanding this as a mater lectionis, it could be vocalized bo, or it could be vocalized bu. Or, if you have a bet followed by a yod, understanding this as a mater lectionis, it could be vocalized bi. Proponents of Lashawan Qadash may balk at the suggestion that this is the case with biblical Hebrew. They may wish to reaffirm their position, declaring that bet wa is never bo or bu, rather it is simply bawa. And so too, they could assert that bet yod never results in bi, rather it is simply and always ba ya. This brings us to a second related point. The academic understanding of the mater lectionis entails that the biblical text is awash in matres lectionis. If we were to reject all the matres lectionis in the Hebrew Bible, this would start to look like a polemic against the biblical text itself. I think that if proponents of Lashawan Qadash saw the extent to which this would have an impact on the text, some of them would wind up denying many of the examples of the concept. Consider as an analogy the words Adam and Edom, or properly pronounced in English, Adam and Edom. The wa in Edom would be an example of a mater lectionis. However, one has to wonder, how comfortable would proponents of Lashawan Qadash be with the idea that the proper spelling for the word Edom, which is to say the name of the nation of Edomites, is identical to the spelling of Adam? How comfortable would they be with that idea? Moreover still, this particular example has direct relevance to the Sakari group, to Al-Azhar's group, as they hold that in Acts 15:17, James read an incorrect reading of Amos 9:12. Part of the issue there is that our extant Hebrew reading of Amos 9:12 has a reference to Edom, while James was either using a text that read instead Adam, or he employed a translation like the Septuagint, which itself translated from a text which read Adam. While the spelling of Adam and Edom is not the only issue with the different readings of Amos 9:12, it is nonetheless a central one. If we were to adopt the position that the correct spelling of the word is without a wa, then that seems to potentially lean towards James' reading being more plausible. At this point, members of the Sakari group might say that the wa in Edom is not a mater lectionis. Rather, they could say it's simply a wa. This even has relevance for names which incorporate a fraction of the tetragrammaton. For example, ancient Hebrew seals of Judahite kings have been found, like this one for King Ahaz. The seal includes the phrase Melech Yehuda, or King of Judah. Let's focus on the word for Judah in particular. What's interesting is the fact that it's spelled without a wa. However, it is spelled with a wa in biblical Hebrew. That is to say, the word for Judah, Yehuda, is spelled with a wa in biblical Hebrew, yet in this ancient Hebrew seal, it was spelled without a wa. It would seem, therefore, fair to conclude that the wa in Yehuda is among the examples of matres lectionis. However, that opens an interesting door, because if even the wa in a name incorporating part of the tetragrammaton can be considered a mater lectionis, then that begs the question, what about the wa in the name for Joshua, Yehoshua? This is the name proponents of Lashawan Qadash pronounce Yahawashi, and thus we are left to wonder, might the wa in Yahawashi be an example of a mater lectionis? At this point, a proponent of Lashawan Qadash might object that that's not a mater lectionis. They might just wave their hand and say, that's just a wa. But that leaves us with a question. Within the paradigm of Lashawan Qadash, how can we ever demonstrate an example of a mater lectionis in an ancient Hebrew text? Couldn't one always just wave their hand and declare, that's just a ya, or that's just a wa? The point here is that the topic of mater lectionis is not a simple one within the paradigm of an assumption of Lashawan Qadash. Therefore, if we are to have a serious discussion on the parameters of matres lectionis with proponents of Lashawan Qadash, we may need the particular proponent with whom we are conversing or corresponding to clarify how they understand the concept. But let's return to Al-Azhar's video.
How did Israelites talk before those things were introduced to their language?
Well, as we already covered, the vocalizations implied by the pointed text of the Masoretic text long predated the introduction of those diacritical marks, of those dots and dashes. Now, by the same token, while we don't have transliterations predating the somewhat speculative mater lectionis, it's nonetheless the case that we don't have any reason to think that the introduction of this writing convention brought about a significant change in pronunciation, as was the case with the pointed text in the Masoretic text. We could say so too with the mater lectionis, that they were introducing a writing convention to reflect vocalizations that already existed, rather than proposing this idea where people were all talking one way and they changed the way they wrote, and suddenly the way they spoke somehow changed to correspond to the writing. It seems to make more sense to me that the writing introduces these new conventions to reflect already existing vocalizations, to clarify their vocalizations.
That's a total cut.
I honestly do not see how that is supposed to be a quote-unquote cut against vocab's position. If anything, it provides yet another example in support of his position. For those who don't know, they were referring to the transliteration of a Hebrew word which appears in Revelation 9:11. The relevant word is a biblical Hebrew term, which is to say it can be found in the Hebrew Bible. The Masoretic text renders that word as Abaddon. There's an O vocalization in there, so it is a vocalization which is contrary to Lashawan Qadash. But did the Masoretes introduce that vocalization? No, they did not. As centuries before the Masoretes, the book of Revelation likewise transliterated it Abaddon.
So yeah. Yes, or Aleph Lamek Yod. You're right. But guess what? It still doesn't make Eli.
While Al-Azhar declares that Aleph Lamed Yod cannot produce Eli, he nonetheless has yet to explain why this ancient text transliterated it that way. It seems that the ancient writer understood that string of characters to be pronounced in precisely that way.
Hold on. Well, if I look in the ancient writings of Hebrew, I don't see vowels.
If by vowels Al-Azhar means the dots and dashes of the Masoretic text, the nikud, the nikudot, if that's what he means, by this point it should be obvious that those symbols are not required to vocalize the text in that way. The symbols represent vocalizations that existed before those symbols were developed. That's the key point here. This ancient text is clearly showing that the word was vocalized that way in the time of Christ.
This is where you get your pronunciation. Listen. Okay, look. So you got the Masoretes, right? They were a group of Jewish.
Bro, this is before the Nazarites.
No, it's not. No, it's not, because those vowels were not there.
With all due respect to Al-Azhar, while he's saying no, it's not, honestly, the response is, I'm sorry, but yes, it is. We're referring to a transliteration in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Matthew, that is before the Masoretes. Matthew was written before the time of the Masoretes.
Who worked between the 6th and the 10th century?
I know this argument.
Primarily,
Rakah found to use this. We know.
Jerusalem, as well as Iraq. Each group compiled to use this
codex to do the kings. You know how you're wrong?
Each group
Read
compiled
the
a system
Septuagint.
of pronunciation and grammatical guides
I know.
in the form of diacritical notes.
Brother, read the Septuagint. When it translates into Hebrew, it lets you know how it's spoken.
No, the Septuagint does not let you know that.
Actually, the Septuagint does provide a number of transliterations which are relevant to questions about Hebrew pronunciation, and we'll get to that in a moment.
It still isn't Paleo, ancient, pre-exilic Hebrew. That's the point, vocab.
I'm sensing another shift in focus here. Note that vocab, when he started this out, he started out as a question about whether or not Jesus spoke Lashawan Qadash, while now Al-Azhar is talking about pre-exilic Hebrew. This raises an interesting question. Does Al-Azhar believe that the Hebrew spoken by Jesus, by Christ, was fundamentally different from the Hebrew spoken in pre-exilic times? That's an interesting question. But if his answer is no, that Jesus was speaking essentially the same language that, or roughly similar language to what was spoken in pre-exilic times, then we would be able to get a sense, within the paradigm of that assumption, we would get a sense of what pre-exilic Hebrew was like, because we have a sense of what Hebrew was like in the time of Christ. And that's the issue here. But let's consider the other alternative. Let's suppose Al-Azhar says, well, actually, Hebrew in the time of Christ was fundamentally different from pre-exilic Hebrew. Okay, working within that paradigm, it seems to be that his assumption is that in pre-exilic times, they were speaking Lashawan Qadash, even though there's no evidence for that. But in the time of Christ, they weren't. That would beg the question, if people weren't speaking Lashawan Qadash in the time of Christ, why do you refer to him by a Lashawan Qadash name? Wouldn't it be the case that in his time, nobody was calling him, quote-unquote, Yahawashi? Wouldn't that be the case if people weren't speaking Lashawan Qadash then?
Yeah, well, I'm supposed to just trust the Greek Septuagint, the source that
Something
our
that
people
cried about
had days of mourning because of how poorly it was translated when you go into the history.
Septuagint studies is a deep and complex subject. If Al-Azhar or the other member of his group would like to discuss certain verses which they feel were translated incorrectly, we can discuss that. But I think, with all due respect to these gentlemen, they're being a bit too flippant. Nonetheless, even if you have disagreements with the way certain texts were translated, that doesn't lead to the conclusion that these men, the translators of the Septuagint, didn't know how Hebrew characters were pronounced. Their transliterations show an ancient understanding of how various Hebrew words were pronounced. And so I want to take a look at the Septuagint to show the significance of this fact. So let me show my Septuagint. We'll take my Septuagint off the shelf and we'll take a look in here. We're going to take a look at some of the transliterations that appear in this text. So first, let's go to 1 Chronicles chapter 6. You have the name Asir, which is spelled with an aleph. It starts with aleph, and so here it is right here, Asir. It's spelled with an aleph, yet it's transliterated with an alpha. Yet in the same verse, or the verse before, you have Elkanah, also spelled with an aleph, yet it's transliterated with an epsilon. Now let's go to 2 Samuel, where you have the name Ishtob, also spelled with an aleph, yet transliterated with an iota. Aside from that, let's jump to Genesis 36, where you have the name Omar, right? Omar, spelled with an aleph, transliterated with an omega. And let's jump back to 1 Chronicles chapter 6 again, and you have the name Uriel, spelled with an aleph, but transliterated with an omicron upsilon. Think about the implications of what was just shown. We have 5 different biblical terms, all starting with aleph, yet that initial character is transliterated 5 different ways. And this touches on a central point here. One major premise of Lashawan Qadash is that each Hebrew character has essentially only one possible vocalization. Meanwhile, the standard understanding of Hebrew, along with other Semitic languages like Arabic and Aramaic, posits that each Hebrew character has multiple possible vocalizations. The ancient transliterations that we just looked at provide clear examples of such. We see that in the ancient understanding, the aleph was not simply pronounced ah, rather it could be vocalized alternatively as ah, e, o, u, and we can show a similar spectrum for the other characters. Now, Al-Azhar wishes to voice his disapproval of the Septuagint, but we see a similar spectrum of vocalizations also appearing in the New Testament, in the writings of Josephus, and in the writings of Philo. Thus, we have a collection of ancient evidence in favor of the conclusion that, in the time of Christ, the Hebrew language had a spectrum of vocalizations which proponents of Lashawan Qadash claim were not part of Hebrew. Now, to be clear, this is not an argument in favor of modern Israeli Hebrew. However, it is an argument against Lashawan Qadash. I would put it this way. We have evidence, ancient evidence, in favor of a standard understanding of ancient Hebrew. Meanwhile, Lashawan Qadash has no evidence in its favor.